"You're fired, Mabel." Orson Pike didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at his boots. That told her everything. She didn't ask why. She already knew. The whole town knew. Vivienne Harcourt had walked into this mercantile 4 days ago, looked at Rhett Calder, looking at Mabel, and decided that a poor fat shopkeeper had no business being looked at like that. Mabel untied her apron, folded it, set it on the counter in a perfect square. Then she walked out into the Colorado morning without a single word, because some battles you lose before they even begin. If that sentence just hit you somewhere deep, you already know this story is yours. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you don't miss a single part. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far Mabel's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. Colorado Territory, 1878. Red Willow Crossing. The kind of town where everybody knew your name, your wage, your dress size, and your mother's medical bills, and none of them felt the slightest obligation to keep any of it to themselves. Mabel Henshaw had understood that truth since she was old enough to carry groceries home on her own. Now she was 28, and she had long since stopped being surprised by what people said when they thought she wasn't listening. The mercantile counter gave them courage somehow. Something about glass and wood between them made people forget that the woman on the other side had ears and feelings and a very precise memory. She had a precise memory for everything. That was both her greatest professional asset and her most private burden. She arrived at Bellwether Mercantile before Orson Pike every single morning. She knew the price of every item in the building without checking the ledger. She knew which suppliers padded their invoices by 10%, and which ones rounded up their weights by 1/8 of a pound, and which ones sent inferior grade goods on the assumption that no one at a small-town mercantile would notice the difference. She noticed every time. She noted it in her ledger, in small, careful handwriting. And she brought it to Orson's attention with the supporting figures, and Orson pocketed the resulting savings without ever once saying thank you. She needed the job. That was the whole of the calculation. She was not a small woman. She had never been small. Large-framed and round-figured with chestnut brown hair, she kept pinned tight because loose hair was impractical. Strong hands, a round and honest face, and brown eyes that had been paying extremely close attention to the world for a very long time. She had learned to keep most of what she observed to herself. Silence was cheaper than conflict, and she could not afford either the time or the consequences of conflict. The town had opinions about her body. It always had. They were delivered in the particular way that small towns deliver such things, not with open cruelty, which could at least be confronted, but with sympathy. That special weapon-shaped sympathy that arrives wearing a smile. Clara Dubois was the most reliable example. She came in on the second Tuesday of every month for fabric, and she never arrived without a remark prepared. That particular Tuesday in April, she came through the door with her shopping basket and her churchwarden smile, and settled at the counter and looked at Mabel the way she always did, that slow-traveling survey from collar to hem before she opened her mouth. "Mabel, honey." She pressed one gloved hand to her chest. "I ran into Dr. Prentice at the post office this morning. He mentioned your mama's been having a harder time of it lately." "She's managing," Mabel said. 3 yards of the blue wool today. 4, I think." Clara leaned forward slightly. "You know, if you ever need anything, any of us at the auxiliary would be happy to bring a dish by the homestead. It must be such a strain on you, carrying all that." A delicate pause. "Responsibility." "That's very kind." Mabel reached for the bolt. "Will you be wanting buttons to match?" Clara watched her measure the fabric with the expression of a woman who had expected more gratitude for the wound she had just delivered. "You really are remarkable, Mabel. I don't know how you manage. Working all day on your feet and then that long walk home and your size." She stopped herself with a little flutter of the hand, as though she had nearly said something indelicate. "Well, you're just so strong." Mabel cut the fabric. Clean edge, straight line. "Thread," she said. Clara blinked. "For the buttons," Mabel said pleasantly. "I have a good ivory that would work with the blue." She finished the transaction and wrapped the fabric and wrote the figures in her ledger and said goodbye with the same steady warmth she brought to every customer. And after Clara left, she stood alone for exactly 10 seconds, with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes on the middle distance. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. That was a Tuesday. The following Monday, the bell above the door rang at 9:30, and Rhett Calder walked in. He owned Calder Ridge Ranch, 7 miles northeast, some of the best grazing land in the territory. Everyone agreed on that. He was 36 broad through the shoulders, dark-eyed with the particular kind of quiet that belonged to men who had spent years making decisions in empty spaces and had gotten comfortable with the silence. He wore a good hat well used, and he tipped it toward Mabel when he came through the door, with an ease that told her the gesture was genuine and not performed. "Morning, ma'am." "Mr. Calder." She set her pencil down. "What can I do for you?" He stood at this counter and appeared to think about it with somewhat more concentration than the question required. "Coffee," he said. "Running low." She reached for the correct tin without turning around. She had his previous order memorized. How much to 2 pounds ought to do it? She measured, wrapped, noted the price. He paid without haggling. He left. That was Monday. Tuesday he came back. "Horseshoe nails," he said, settling at the counter with the same unhurried ease. "Any particular size? Standard'll do." She measured them into a paper sack. He paid. He left. Wednesday, lamp oil. Thursday, a new hammer. Mabel sold to him, without remarking on the fact that she had sold him a hammer the previous autumn, and it had not appeared to have developed any structural deficiencies in the interim. Friday, flour. She set the flour sack on the counter and looked at him. "Your cook was in here 2 days ago," she said. "Full sack." Rhett looked at the flour with an expression of complete and untroubled sincerity. "That's so." "It is." He scratched the back of his neck. "We go through it fast." "I'm sure you do," she said. He paid for the flour. He left. He came back the following Monday. And the Monday after that. The purchases evolved. Cinnamon black pepper, a coil of rope, sandpaper, a second tin of coffee, within 10 days of the first, and Mabel kept a perfect record of every transaction, and said nothing about the pattern she had identified with complete clarity by the end of the second week. But she noticed everything. She noticed he always chose her end of the counter. She noticed he was never in a hurry, even when the mercantile was busy. She noticed their conversations had begun to accumulate a comment she made about a supplier's inflated invoice that he picked up and turned into a real question, an observation he offered about the dry season that she pushed back on with specific numbers. A moment in the third week when they had both laughed at the same time, at something entirely ordinary, and then looked at each other and neither could quite explain what was funny. He had a dry humor he kept well hidden behind a serious face. It caught her by surprise every time. She liked that about him. She also noticed that he never once looked at her the way the Alderton brothers did when they came in for tobacco. He looked at her face when she spoke. He waited for her to finish before he responded. When she corrected him on a matter of fact, and she did twice, because the facts were what they were, he said, "You're right," with the ease of a man who had no particular investment in being wrong. Mabel found this so unusual, she had to actively stop herself from remarking on it. 2 weeks into this pattern, he leaned against her counter over a completely implausible purchase of mixed spice tins and said conversationally, "You ever think about bookkeeping work, Mabel?" She looked up from her ledger. "In what context?" "Calder Ridge has been needing someone to manage the ranch accounts for about 2 years, he said. "Purchasing records, payroll, supplier invoices. The kind of work you do here, but for considerably better pay." She studied him for a moment. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Calder." "It's a practical one. I've watched you catch 3 billing errors in the time it takes most people to count change." "The ranch is 7 miles from my mother's house," she said. "I can't manage that distance and still get home each evening. She needs me there." He nodded once. No argument. No pressure. He tucked the spice tins under his arm and paid and left, and Mabel stood at her counter afterward, with her hands pressed flat against the wood, and gave herself a firm internal and entirely private talking to about the difference between things that were sensible and things that she actually felt. She came down firmly on the side of sensible. She always did. He asked again 3 weeks later. Same even tone, same practical framing. She refused again, same reason. He accepted it the same way, a single nod, no argument, and bought an unnecessary quantity of dried beans and left. The unnecessary beans nearly broke her composure entirely, which she considered deeply unreasonable and refused to examine further. Then came the afternoon in early June, when Vivienne Harcourt opened the mercantile door and the whole quality of the air changed. Mabel had seen Vivienne before everyone had, but never inside the mercantile. Vivienne had someone for that. She was Cornelius Harcourt's only daughter, and Cornelius Harcourt was president of Red Willow Bank and held the largest outstanding note against Calder Ridge Ranch, a fact Mabel knew because she knew every financial fact worth knowing in this town. Vivienne was impeccably dressed, perfectly postured, and beautiful in the way that money made easier, not unkind beauty, but beauty that had never once been asked to justify itself. Her eyes moved around the mercantile immediately, and found Rhett Calder leaning against Mabel's counter with his fabricated interest in a display of pepper tins. Something shifted in Vivienne's face. Not surprise. Calculation arriving at a conclusion. Rhett. She crossed the floor with a warm, easy smile. I didn't expect to find you here. Rhett straightened. Miss Harcourt. He tipped his hat. Courteous, not warm. I was hoping to run into you, actually. She positioned herself at the counter, not quite beside him, but close enough that the geometry of it was its own kind of statement. Father would like to arrange a meeting this week about your account. Would Thursday work? Thursday's fine, Rhett said. Vivienne turned the warm smile toward Mabel. And you must be Mabel Henshaw. She met the woman's eyes directly. Can I help you find something, Miss Harcourt? Vivienne looked at her. Not the way Clara Dubois looked at her. Not with that costumed pity. She looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they are calculating the weight of. Quick, thorough, precise. Then the smile returned full warmth, not a crack in it. Just browsing, thank you. She stayed 11 minutes. She bought a small jar of imported preserves she absolutely could have sent someone else for. She spoke to Rhett twice more across the room, with the fluent ease of a woman who had grown up knowing exactly how to occupy any space she entered. And before she left, she looked at Mabel one more time. Just once. Just long enough. Mabel went back to her invoice. She finished reconciling the numbers. She straightened her receipts. She did everything with the same steady competence she brought to every task, and she did not let herself think about what that look meant until after Vivienne's footsteps had faded down the street outside. Then she thought about it very clearly, and she understood. The following morning, Clara Dubois was waiting outside before Mabel even had the key in the lock, practically vibrating. Mabel. Her voice was honeyed with the particular pleasure of bad news delivered under the banner of concern. I heard the most extraordinary thing at the Alderton supper last night. Now you know I am not a gossip. I know, Mabel said, opening the door. They are saying. Clara followed her inside, breathless. That you have been deliberately encouraging Rhett Calder's visits. That you are trying to get yourself attached to that ranch. She placed her hand on her chest. Can you imagine? People can be so cruel. Mabel turned around slowly. Clara. Her voice was quiet, completely level. Did you repeat it? Clara opened her mouth, closed it. When you heard it at the Alderton supper, Mabel said just as quietly, did you repeat it to the table or wait until you had a wider audience? The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Clara's smile went glassy at the edges. I only wanted to warn you, Mabel, as a friend. Of course. Mabel walked to the counter. 3 yards of blue wool, same as usual. She measured the fabric, cut it clean, wrapped it, logged the price, counted out Clara's change to the penny. And she did not say another word about it, and Clara, deprived of the reaction she had come for, left looking vaguely cheated. When the door closed, Mabel gripped the counter's edge with both hands. She had known it was coming. From the moment Vivienne Harcourt looked at her across that floor, she had known something was being assembled. She had simply underestimated the speed. The story was already moving through Red Willow Crossing. The fat shopkeeper setting her cap for the wealthy rancher. Working her way up from behind the counter into something she had no business wanting. She knew how that story ended. She had watched it end before for other women in this same town. The woman becomes the object of amusement. The man drifts away because the social cost of staying is too high. And the woman is left exactly where she began, except now everyone has a permanent opinion about her and her ambitions and the embarrassing visibility of her wanting. She was not angry at Rhett. She had been very precise with herself about that. He had not done anything wrong. He had been kind, genuinely kind, in the particular way she had almost no experience receiving, not the pity-shaped kindness of Clara Dubois, but the kind that paid attention, that saw her arithmetic and her patience and her dry humor, and decided those things were worth returning to repeatedly under the pretense of needing sandpaper. She had found it touching. She still found it touching. But touching was not the same as wise, and she had built her entire adult life on the distinction between those two things. She let out one long breath. She picked up her pencil. She was 3 entries into the afternoon ledger when the bell above the door rang and Rhett Calder walked in, carrying a completely inexplicable sack of dried beans. She looked at the beans. He set them on the counter with the expression of a man prepared to defend their necessity to his last breath. "We need to talk," she said. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. She set her pencil down, folded her hands on the counter. "People are talking, Rhett." He didn't flinch at his own name coming back at him. "I know. They're saying I've been encouraging your visits deliberately, that I'm trying to attach myself to Calder Ridge." She held his gaze directly. "I understand what that costs you with the bank. And I need you to understand what it costs me here." "Who started it?" he said. "That doesn't matter." "Mabel." "It doesn't matter," she said again, steady. "What matters is that it's moving. And the longer you stand at my counter buying things you don't need, the faster it moves and the worse it gets. For both of us." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hat brim, then back at her. "You think I should stop coming in?" he said. "I think you should buy things you actually need," she said carefully, "when you actually need them." "And if I need beans, Rhett." Her voice came out softer than she intended. She corrected for it. "Your cook orders bulk dry goods from Harmon's supply wagon every 3rd Saturday. You haven't needed beans from this counter once in the 14 weeks you've been coming in here." He looked at the bean sack on her counter. She watched something move through his face, not embarrassment exactly, more like a man making a decision about how honest he was willing to be. "No," he said. "I haven't." The silence between them changed quality. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know why I've been coming in here," he said. "And I'm not going to walk away from this counter and stay away because Vivienne Harcourt decided this town needed a new piece of gossip." He looked at her directly. "But I hear what you're telling me. And I understand what it costs you. So I'll ask you something instead." She waited. "The offer I made you. Bookkeeper at Calder Ridge." He picked up the bean sack and set it aside. "I'm making it again. 3rd time. And this time I want you to think about it as what it actually is, which is the best solution to a problem we have both just described to each other, not as charity and not as something complicated." "The distance," she started. "There's a cottage," he said, "on the east side of the main house. Nobody's used it in 3 years. Your mother could be comfortable there. Your brother too if he needs work, because I need an extra hand come fall." He paused. "I'm not asking you to accept anything you haven't earned. I'm telling you, I have a vacancy for the most qualified person I've met in this county, and that person is currently selling beans to ranchers who don't need them because she can't afford to turn away a sale." Mabel stared at him. "That's not an argument," she said. "That's a corner." "It's an offer," he said quietly. "There's a difference." She looked down at her ledger. At 14 weeks of weekly entries, each one a small meticulous record of what she had refused to let herself believe was happening. "I need time to think," she said. "Take it," he said. He pushed the beans across the counter. "I'll take these too. We genuinely might need them by now." She charged him full price. He paid it without blinking. And when he left, Mabel Henshaw stood alone at her counter in the late afternoon light, with her ledger open in front of her, and her hands not entirely steady, and the full, terrifying weight of the realization that she was 28 years old. And this was the first time in her entire adult life that anyone had looked at what she was capable of and called it an asset instead of an inconvenience. She did not know yet what she would decide. She did not know that the decision would be made for her brutally and without warning within the week. She did not know about the conversation that had already taken place between Vivienne Harcourt and Orson Pike, or what Vivienne had offered and what Orson had agreed to. She only knew that her hands were not steady, and that she needed them to be, and that she pressed them flat against the counter the way she always did when she needed to remember who she was and what she was made of, and why she had never not once allowed herself to fall apart where anyone could see it. The counter held. It always held. That was the one thing in Red Willow Crossing Mabel Henshaw had always been able to count on. She just didn't know yet that she was about to lose it. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid. Mabel Henshaw had faced enough hard mornings to know that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford after dark. She lay on her narrow bed in the homestead and stared at the ceiling and ran numbers in her head, the way she always did when the world got loud, not because the numbers were comforting, but because they were honest, and honesty, even brutal honesty, was something she could work with. She had 3 days to give Rhett an answer. She had not told him that. She had told him she needed time to think, and he had accepted that without pressure, and the absence of pressure had been paradoxically the most destabilizing part of the entire conversation. Men who wanted something from Mabel Henshaw had always applied pressure. That was how she knew what they wanted. Rhett's patience didn't feel like strategy. It felt genuine. And genuineness in her experience was either the rarest thing in the world or the most dangerous disguise. She didn't know yet which one it was. What she did know, lying there in the dark, with her mother's slow breathing, audible through the thin wall between their rooms, was that the household box in the kitchen drawer held $43 and some cents. That her brother Silas's fall labor contract hadn't been renewed yet. That her mother's medicine cost $6 a month, and the property tax came due in 8 weeks, and the feed bill for their 2 remaining animals was 3 weeks overdue. She knew those numbers the way she knew her own heartbeat. And she knew that if Orson Pike ever decided her wages weren't worth the trouble, she might be causing his more valuable accounts. She would be standing in the street with $43 between her family and a crisis she could not arithmetic her way out of. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. By morning she had not made a decision, but she had gotten very clear on exactly how little margin she had left. She was still turning it over when she walked through the mercantile door the next day and found Orson Pike waiting for her at the counter with his hands folded and his eyes on the floor, and she understood before he opened his mouth that the decision had just been made for her. "Mabel," he said, "I need to talk to you about something." "I'm listening," she said. He cleared his throat. "There's been a complaint about the change from Mrs. Alderton's purchase last Thursday." Mabel set her bag down slowly. "Mrs. Alderton purchased $1.14 worth of ribbon and thread. She gave me $2. I returned 86 cents. It's in the ledger." "She says it's not right." "Mrs. Alderton is mistaken," Mabel said. "The ledger is there. The figures are there. You can check them against the till record yourself." "I did check them." Orson finally looked at her. He had the expression of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had already decided the cost was acceptable. "The figures look right, Mabel, but the Alderton family is one of our larger accounts, and Mrs. Alderton she's very certain about what she remembers." The silence between them lasted a long time. "You're going to dock my wages," Mabel said. He looked at the floor again. "How much?" she said. $1.50. She did the arithmetic instantly, automatically. $1.50 out of her weekly wage was not catastrophic by itself. It was the signal it sent that was catastrophic. It meant that any account large enough to matter could accuse her of any error they chose to invent, and Orson would choose the account over her arithmetic every single time, because Orson always chose the money. "All right," she said. "I'm sorry, Mabel. I want you to know that." "I do know that," she said, and she meant it. She was not angry at Orson Pike for being exactly the kind of man he had always been. She was angry at herself for needing a job badly enough that it had to matter. She tied on her apron and opened the ledger and went to work. She was 2 hours into the morning when Clara Dubois came in, and this time Clara didn't even have the decency to pretend she had come for fabric. "I heard about the Alderton business," Clara said, immediately settling her elbows on the counter with the satisfied air of someone delivering confirmation of a diagnosis they'd already made. "Terrible shame, Mabel. Arithmetic errors can happen to anyone." "There was no arithmetic error," Mabel said. "Of course." Clara's eyes were bright and busy. "You know what people are saying, though? They're saying it's because you've been distracted. All that attention from a certain rancher." She let that sit for a moment. "Some people are saying you've got ideas above your station. I'm not saying it. I just want you to know what's being said as a friend." Mabel looked at her steadily. "What would you like to buy today, Clara?" Clara's mouth tightened slightly. "Nothing today. I just came to... Then I need to get back to work." Mabel turned to the ledger. "You have a good morning." The door swung shut behind Clara Dubois with a force that suggested she was not entirely satisfied with how the visit had gone. Mabel pressed her pencil to the page and held it there for a moment without writing anything. She was beginning to understand the shape of what was happening. The wage docking was not about Mrs. Alderton's change. Mrs. Alderton's change had been exact, and Orson knew it. This was the first stone in a wall being built around her, and the wall was being built by someone with more patience and more resources than Mabel had previously credited. Vivienne Harcourt did not need to get her hands dirty. She only needed to make Mabel inconvenient enough that the people around her would make the necessary choices on their own. And they would, because they always did. Mabel understood that with a cold, flat certainty that had nothing to do with self-pity and everything to do with experience. She went back to her figures and finished the morning without another word to anyone. 3 days later, Orson called her to the back room again. She knew before he spoke. "Mabel." His voice was quieter this time, more ashamed, which somehow made it worse. "The Harcourt family has indicated they may be moving their business accounts elsewhere. They represent nearly a fifth of our monthly revenue. I can't..." He stopped, swallowed. "I can't keep you on. I'm sorry. It's not fair. I know it's not fair." Mabel stood very still. "When?" she said. "End of the week. I'll need my full wages through Friday." "Yes, of course. Mabel, I want you to know. You don't need to say anything else, Orson." Her voice came out perfectly level. "I understand the position you're in." She untied her apron. She folded it with the same precision she always used. She set it on the counter in a perfect square, and she picked up her bag, and she walked out of Bellwether Mercantile for the last time without looking back. She made it 4 blocks before she stopped walking, not because she wanted to, because her body required it. She stood on the edge of the boardwalk in the full morning sun of Red Willow Crossing, and breathed with great deliberate care, and looked at the street in front of her and did the arithmetic one more time. $43. Less now with the wage docking. 8 weeks to the property tax. Her mother's medicine. The feed bill. She had never in 10 years of managing this family's finances through drought and illness, and her father's death, and 3 failed harvests, arrived at a number she could not work with. She was looking at one now. She turned around and walked home. She did not tell Dorothea that evening. Her mother was having a worse day. Her breathing labored, her color poor. And Mabel made soup from what was in the kitchen and sat beside her bed while she ate and talked about small things, comfortable things, and kept every number locked behind her eyes where it couldn't do any additional damage. After Dorothea slept, she went to the kitchen and opened the cash box and sat down at the table with a candle and a piece of paper and worked through the numbers one more time, exhaustively looking for any margin she had missed. She found none. Silas came in from the barn at 9:30 and saw her face and sat down across from her without being asked. "How bad?" he said. She slid the paper across to him. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. "What are you going to do?" "Find work," she said. "Where?" "I don't know yet." "Mabel." "I'll find something," she said, and the firmness in her voice was not reassurance. It was a refusal to let him see her without a plan, because if Silas saw her without a plan, he would panic, And a panicking Silas was one more thing she could not manage right now. She folded the paper. She put it in her pocket. She said goodnight and went to bed and lay there in the dark, doing the same arithmetic over and over until it became something like a rhythm, like counting beats, like a sound that kept the silence from getting too large. She was still doing it when she heard the rooster. She got up. She dressed. She started looking. The next 5 days were the most methodically humiliating of Mabel Henshaw's adult life, and she endured them with the same composure she brought to everything, which meant nobody who saw her in those 5 days would have guessed anything was wrong. She went to the laundry. They weren't hiring. She went to the hotel. Full staff. She went to 3 separate households who she knew needed domestic help, and was told at each of them with varying degrees of apologetic discomfort that they had just filled the position or were no longer sure they needed one. She went to the grain merchant and offered to manage his accounts at a rate considerably below what her work was worth, and was told he handled his own books. She went everywhere. She came home each evening to make supper and sit with Dorothea and present a face that said everything was progressing according to plan. And then she sat at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep and updated the number in her head. 3 weeks, maybe less. On the 6th day, she was walking back through the center of town from another unsuccessful inquiry when she heard her name. Mabel. She turned. Rhett Calder was coming across the street toward her with his hat in his hands, which meant he had taken it off before he crossed, which was a thing she noticed and filed away without meaning to. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there stopped him for a fraction of a second before he kept moving. "I heard about Pike," he said. "News travels," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, which was the most technically dishonest thing she had said in recent memory, but she said it with such complete conviction that a lesser observer might have believed it. Rhett was not a lesser observer. "Walk with me," he said, not a command. The kind of suggestion that leaves room for no, but makes clear that yes would be welcome. She walked with him. They went down the side street away from the main thoroughfare, where the foot traffic was lighter and the likelihood of Clara Dubois appearing from a doorway was reduced. Rhett didn't speak until they were clear of the main street, and when he did, he didn't waste the space. "The offer still stands," he said. "Rhett, I know what you're going to say," he said, "and I need you to hear me out first. The cottage on the east side. I had my men clear it out this week. New stove's already been ordered. It's not grand, but it's solid and it's warm and it's 4 rooms, which is more than enough for your mother to be comfortable." He paused. "I'm not offering you charity. I have not once in this conversation used the word charity, and I'm not going to start now. What I am telling you is that I have a position that needs filling, a property that needs occupying, and a ranch that has been hemorrhaging money for 2 years because nobody has been paying proper attention to the accounts." Mabel stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. "You cleared out the cottage before I gave you an answer," she said. He met her eyes. "I had reasonable confidence in the direction things were heading." "That is an extraordinarily presumptuous thing to do." "Yes," he said simply, "it is." She stared at him. He stared back. And somewhere underneath her exhaustion and her pride and the very real, very specific number she had been carrying around in her chest for 6 days, she felt something shift, not dramatically, not like something breaking open, but like a door that had been stuck for a long time, finally moving on its hinge. "What does the position pay?" she said. He told her. It was more than twice what Orson Pike had been paying her. She kept her face perfectly neutral. "I'll need to discuss it with my family." "Of course. And I'll need to see the actual accounts before I agree to anything. I won't take a position without knowing what I'm walking into. I'd expect nothing less. And I want it understood from the start that my work at Calder Ridge is professional. It's not—" She paused, choosing words with care. "It's not something else." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. "Mabel," he said quietly, "I have spent 3 months inventing reasons to buy things I didn't need, so I could stand at your counter for 12 minutes on a Monday morning. I think we both know I'd like it to be something else eventually if you ever decide you want that. But I'm not going to put that on a woman who just lost her job and needs to feed her family. That's not who I am." The honesty of it hit her somewhere she was not prepared for. She had been braced for maneuvering, for a man using her circumstances as leverage, even gently, even kindly. She had been waiting for the condition hidden inside the offer, the small print that would eventually make her feel like the transaction she had always suspected she was. There was none. Just a man standing in the street with his hat in his hands, telling her the truth. "I'll talk to Silas tonight," she said. "I'll be at the ranch tomorrow morning," he said. "Whenever you're ready." He put his hat back on. He nodded once. He walked back toward the main street without making the moment into anything larger than it was, and Mabel stood where he'd left her for a moment before she turned and walked home. She talked to Silas that night after Dorothea was asleep. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was not typical of Silas, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "You already decided," he said. "I'm asking your opinion." "You already decided," he said again without accusation. "You decided about 4 minutes into telling me. I can always tell because you stop looking at me when you're asking for permission and start looking at me when you already know the answer." Mabel opened her mouth, closed it. "Is he a good man?" Silas asked. She thought about it with the careful honesty she brought to every real question. "I think so," she said. "I'm not certain yet, but I think so." "Good enough," Silas said. "When do we go?" They arrived at Calder Ridge on a Friday morning, and within the first hour, Mabel understood 3 things simultaneously. The first was that the cottage was genuinely comfortable, solid walls, a working stove, 4 clean rooms that smelled of fresh air and recent effort, and a window in the main room that caught the morning light in a way that made her think her mother might actually sleep better here than she had in months. The second was that Rhett Calder's ranch hands were watching her arrival with expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to outright skepticism, and that she was going to have to establish herself with every single one of them before they would take a single instruction from her without a sideways glance. The third and most important was that Calder Ridge's financial situation was considerably worse than anyone had let on. Rhett showed her the books himself, sitting across the desk from her in the ranch office, with the same direct honesty he had used in the street 2 days before. And Mabel read through the ledgers with the systematic attention she gave every set of numbers, and felt the particular cold clarity that arrived when figures told her something their owner hadn't fully admitted yet. "How long have you been carrying this?" she asked. "2 bad seasons," he said. "Dry summer, expensive winter feed. I made some purchasing decisions that made sense at the time. You have duplicate invoices here from 3 separate suppliers." She turned a page. "This hay purchase was billed twice in November. This fence repair was paid once to the contractor, and once again, 6 weeks later, under a different line item. This—" She stopped, looked up at him. "Rhett, has anyone actually been looking at these accounts?" "My foreman was managing it," he said. "He's better with cattle than figures." "I can see that." She went back to the ledger. "You have been paying for things you've already paid for, and several things you may not have received at all." She turned another page. Her voice remained completely professional and entirely level. "This isn't just disorganization. Someone has been taking advantage of disorganized books." The silence in the office changed quality. "Can you prove that?" he said. "Give me 2 weeks with these records," she said. "I'll show you exactly what happened, who did it, and how much it cost you." He looked at her across the desk for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll need full access to everything. Every invoice, every receipt, every payroll record going back 3 years. You'll have it. And I need your foreman to understand that when I ask for documentation, I'm not questioning his judgment about cattle. I'm doing my job." "I'll talk to him. Today," she said. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Today," he agreed. She went to work. She went to work the way she always went to work, which was completely and without ceremony. She started with the oldest records and moved forward chronologically, logging every discrepancy in a separate column, and what emerged over the following days was a picture she had half suspected, and which turned out to be worse than her suspicion. A supplier named Garrett Finch had been billing Calder Ridge for feed quantities 20% above what had actually been delivered consistently for nearly 2 years. A second contractor had submitted duplicate repair invoices on 3 separate occasions. A third smaller issue, petty cash withdrawals that didn't correspond to any documented expense, pointed toward someone with direct access to the office. She brought it to Rhett on a Tuesday evening when the hands had gone to supper. She set the documented figures on the desk between them and walked him through it without editorializing, just the numbers and what they demonstrated. He read through it. His jaw was tight. "Finch has been supplying this ranch for 8 years, he said. "I know," she said. "And for 6 of those years, the invoices are clean. The discrepancies begin 22 months ago, which is 2 months after your previous bookkeeper left and 4 months before your first bad season." She paused. He saw the opening and he used it. "That's what the numbers say." "How much total?" she told him. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "That's not enough to save the ranch," he said. "Not by itself." "No," she said. "But it's not nothing either. And stopping it going forward changes your monthly position significantly. Combined with some purchasing reorganization and a few other adjustments I've identified." She set a second sheet on the desk. "You're not out of the woods, but you're less far in than you were a week ago." He looked at the second sheet. He read through it. "You did all this in 8 days, he said. "The numbers were there," she said. "Someone just had to look at them." Howe was quiet for a moment. "What adjustments?" "You're ordering hay from Finch's operation at a higher rate than 2 other local suppliers. Switching contracts saves you $11 a month. Your kitchen purchasing is completely untracked. Your cook is buying on habit, not on inventory, which means you're carrying spoilage you're paying for twice. A basic supply log fixes that." She turned the page. "Your eastern grazing parcel is sitting unused through the winter. Leasing those rights to the Morrison outfit for the season brings in enough to cover 3 months of loan interest." Rhett looked at her. "You've been here 8 days, he said. 8 days, she agreed. He leaned back in his chair and studied her with an expression she couldn't quite classify, something between admiration and the particular look of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. "Why didn't you just tell Orson Pike his suppliers were stealing from him?" he said. "He didn't give me access to the supplier accounts," she said. "He gave me the retail till." "Because he didn't want to know," Rhett said. "Because knowing would have required him to do something about it," she said. "And doing something about it would have required courage." Rhett smiled at that fully this time, and it changed his face in a way she had not seen before. "You have a brutal way of saying true things, Mabel." "I prefer accurate," she said. "Accurate," he agreed. She gathered her papers. She was almost to the office door when he said her name. She turned. "Thank you," he said, simply, without addition. She nodded once and left. She walked back across the yard to the cottage in the cool evening air and let herself in quietly. Dorothea was already sleeping. Silas had gone to check the annals, and she sat down at the small kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them in the lamplight. She had forgotten what it felt like to be useful, not needed, not depended upon. Those things she had felt every day for 10 years. Useful was different. Useful meant her specific skills, her specific mind. The exact particular thing that made Mabel Henshaw who she was, that was the thing that mattered here. That was the thing that had been wanted enough for a man to clear out a cottage and order a new stove before she'd even given him an answer. She sat there for a long time. Then she got up and made tea and took a cup to Dorothea's bedside table, for when she woke and stood in the doorway of her mother's room and listened to her breathing, which was easier tonight than it had been in weeks, and thought about the window in the front room and the morning light. She did not let herself think about Rhett Calder's smile, or she tried not to. She was not entirely successful. The following week she began selling. It started practically without plan or intention. She had processed a surplus of autumn fruit that the ranch kitchen wasn't using, plums, going soft apples past their keeping point, and rather than watch them waste, she spent a Saturday morning making preserves using the cottage kitchen and her mother's old recipe, because waste offended her on a level that was almost physical. She made 14 jars. She brought 4 to the ranch kitchen. She put the other 10 in a basket and took them to town on Monday, when she rode in with the supply wagon to verify the new Finch invoice personally. She sold all 10 before noon. The woman at the milliner's wanted to know if she could get more. The hotel cook asked about bread. A rancher's wife on the edge of town ordered 6 jars of apple preserves and asked about dried herbs. Mabel came back to Calder Ridge with an empty basket and more orders than she had inventory to fill. She told Rhett that evening. He listened. Then he said, "Use whatever you need from the ranch kitchen garden. The surplus is yours." She looked at him. "I'd want to pay a reasonable rate for the produce." "Mabel, it's not your charity garden, Rhett. It's a ranch asset. I'm proposing a supply arrangement." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want to pay me for plums. I want to establish a clean business relationship," she said, "so that when this grows into something real, and it will, the terms are already clear, and nobody owes anybody anything they didn't agree to up front." He leaned against the fence post and crossed his arms. The expression on his face was one she was beginning to recognize somewhere between amusement and deep respect, wearing the mask of the second one. 10% of the sale price, he said. "Back to the ranch." 8, she said. 9. "Done," she said. He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely professional, but it was a full 3 seconds before he let go, and she noticed that too, and refused to do anything about it. She went back to the cottage and sat down with her notebook and began calculating how many jars she could produce per week with consistent access to the garden surplus. Outside, she could hear Silas talking with one of the ranch hands near the barn, laughing at something easy and relaxed in a way he hadn't been in months. Her mother had eaten a full supper for the first time in 2 weeks. The numbers in her notebook were not comfortable, but they were workable, and workable was a place Mabel Henshaw knew how to build from. She was good at building. She had just never had anything to build toward that was entirely hers. She put her pencil down. She looked at the lamp. She thought about Rhett Calder leaning against that fence post with his arms crossed and that expression on his face, and she thought about a man who spent 3 months inventing reasons to buy cinnamon and sandpaper and beans he didn't need, and she thought about the fact that he had given her this position, this cottage, this garden, this beginning, and had asked for absolutely nothing back. And she thought about how dangerous that was, not because she didn't trust him, but because she was beginning to. In Red Willow Crossing, word moved fast. Word that Mabel Henshaw had been taken in at Calder Ridge moved faster. Vivienne Harcourt heard it within 2 days, and what she did with that information was considerably worse than anything she had done before. Because before, Mabel had been a shopkeeper with a rumor attached to her. Now she was a woman living on a wealthy rancher's property, earning his wages, working his books within 100 yards of him every single day. That was not a rumor. That was a story. And Vivienne Harcourt had always known exactly what to do with a story. What neither Mabel nor Rhett knew yet was that Vivienne had already been to see her father, and that Cornelius Harcourt had already scheduled a meeting, and that the meeting was not about Rhett's loan repayment schedule. The meeting was about something considerably larger than that, and it was coming in 3 weeks, and by the time it arrived, everything Mabel had just begun to build was going to be sitting directly in its path. 3 weeks passed. Hard weeks do fast on the surface, and slow underneath, full of small victories that felt significant and quiet dread that never quite went away. Mabel had reorganized every supply account at Calder Ridge by the end of the 2nd week. The Finch contract was terminated with a letter she wrote herself, precise and unarguable, documenting every discrepancy with supporting invoice numbers and delivery records. Rhett signed it without changing a word. Finch tried to dispute it in town, told 3 different people that the new woman at the ranch didn't know what she was looking at, and was met with the uncomfortable reality that Mabel had attached copies of every flagged invoice to the termination letter and filed a duplicate with the county clerk's office, which meant anyone who wanted to verify her arithmetic was welcome to do so. Nobody disputed it after that. The ranch hands had stopped looking at her sideways by the end of the 1st week, which was faster than she'd expected. It happened because of a Thursday morning when the supply wagon came back from town with a hay invoice that was 40 pounds short of what had been ordered, and Mabel caught it before the wagon was even unloaded, because she had the purchase order in her hand when it arrived, and she counted the bales herself standing in the yard without asking anyone for help. The foreman, a quiet, weathered man named Cole Briggs, who had initially regarded her arrival with the particular suspicion of a man whose professional territory had just been reorganized, watched her do it and then helped her stack the documentation for the return claim without a word. And after that, they had a working relationship that functioned on mutual respect and the shared understanding that neither of them needed to talk much to get things done. Dorothea's color had improved. The window in the cottage's front room caught the morning light exactly the way Mabel had thought it would, and her mother sat in it every day with her mending and her Bible, and the slower, quieter rhythm of a woman whose body was not fighting the cold anymore. She asked fewer questions about Rhett Calder than Mabel had braced for. What she asked instead were small, careful questions about the ranch, the work, the accounts, as though she understood that the work was the safest place to begin and that everything else would come clear in its own time. Silas had been taken on full-time after Cole Briggs watched him handle a difficult horse with a patience and instinct that told an experienced man everything he needed to know. He came home to the cottage each evening louder and more tired than he'd been in 2 years, which was the particular tiredness of a person who had finally found work that matched their actual capacity, and Mabel found it so quietly satisfying that she had to stop herself from mentioning it more than once. And the preserves business had grown faster than she had conservatively projected. 6 ranches were now on a regular order schedule. The hotel kitchen had taken a standing weekly bread order. A dry goods merchant 2 towns over had written to inquire about wholesale quantities. She was working from the cottage kitchen in the early mornings before her ranch bookkeeping began, and the numbers in her private notebook were moving in a direction she had not let herself fully believe in yet, because she had learned that believing in numbers before they were certain was the fastest way to get hurt by them. But they were moving. She was careful not to let any of this show on her face in Rhett's presence, not because she didn't trust him. She had long since passed the point of pretending she didn't trust him. It was something more complicated than that. He had given her all of this, the position, the cottage, the garden access, the supply arrangement, and he had asked for nothing, and the nothing was the thing she couldn't stop thinking about. Every time she caught herself feeling something warm and specific when he came to the office doorway in the evening to check in on the accounts, she reminded herself of the arithmetic of their situation and what it meant that she still needed this job, still needed this roof, still needed the wage. He paid her. She would not be the woman who mistook gratitude for love. She had too much self-respect for that, and she would not let him wonder whether she did. So she kept it professional and warm and honest, and she did not let herself linger when he leaned over her desk to look at a figure she was pointing to, and she did not acknowledge the fact that their conversations over coffee in the early mornings had gradually become the best part of her working day. She was managing it perfectly, right up until the morning. Cole Briggs came to the office door and said, "Rhett's been called to the bank. Cornelius Harcourt sent a message this morning. Meetings at 2 o'clock. Mabel set her pencil down. "Did the message say what it was about?" she asked. Cole shook his head. "Just that it was urgent." She looked at the ledger in front of her. The numbers were better than they'd been 3 weeks ago. They were not good enough. The outstanding loan balance sat at the top of every page, like a weight she'd been working around, and she knew down to the dollar what Calder Ridge currently owed Cornelius Harcourt, and she knew that the improvement she'd achieved, real as it was, had not moved that number enough to change the conversation Rhett was about to walk into. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Cole." She picked up her pencil and went back to work. Rhett left for town at 1 o'clock. He stopped at the cottage on his way out and told Mabel he'd be back before supper. He said it matter-of-factly the way he said most things, and she said all right, and went back to the column she was totaling and did not let herself watch him ride out. She was still at her desk at 4 o'clock when she heard him come back. She heard it in his footsteps before he reached the office door. She had been listening to Rhett Calder walk across that yard for 3 weeks, and she knew the rhythm of his usual pace, the unhurried, deliberate sound of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. What she heard now was different, faster, contained. The footsteps of a man who had absorbed something difficult and was carrying it with great deliberate care. He opened the office door and stepped inside and closed it behind him, She looked up. His face told her it was bad. "Sit down," she said. "I'm all right standing." "Rhett," she set her pencil down. "Sit down." He sat. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his hands. Then he said, "Cornelius Harcourt called the note." The room went very still. "The full balance," she said. "In 90 days. She did the arithmetic before the words were out of his mouth. The outstanding balance. The current cash position. The projected revenue from the lease arrangement and the reduced supply costs and the recovery on the Finch overcharges. She added them up and subtracted them and looked at what was left, and it was not enough. Not by a significant distance. There was something else, Rhett said. She waited. He reached into his jacket and set a folded document on the desk between them. He didn't say anything. Just looked at it. She opened it. It was a legal proposal. She read it with the same systematic attention she brought to every document, and she read it twice, and when she was finished, she set it flat on the desk and looked at Rhett across the surface of it. "He's offering to erase the debt," she said. "Yes. In exchange for a marriage contract between you and Vivienne Harcourt." "Yes." The silence between them lasted a very long time. "He presented this as a business arrangement," Rhett said. His voice was flat and even and completely controlled, which told her more about his state than any amount of visible emotion would have. "Said it made practical sense. Combined Harcourt capital with Calder land. Said Vivienne was agreeable, and that I should consider it seriously." "Was Vivienne in the room?" Mabel asked. She walked in about 5 minutes into the meeting. "Wearing her good dress," he said. "Yes." Mabel looked at the document. "This was not a spontaneous meeting," she said. "This was prepared in advance. The legal language here is specific and complete. Someone spent time drafting this." "I know." "Which means Vivienne knew what the meeting was before you did." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you—" She focused on the document. "And Cornelius. He said he'd give me 2 weeks to reconsider." "Did Vivienne say anything?" Rhett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She said a few things. About the ranch." "About you," he said. Mabel looked up. She said my interest in you was loneliness. That a man who'd spent too much time on his own ranch would mistake a poor woman's practicality for something more significant than it was." He paused. "She said it kindly, which was the part that bothered me most." Mabel held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "That's the smartest thing Vivienne Harcourt has done since this started. She said it kindly, so you couldn't argue with it without sounding defensive." "I noticed that," he said. "I still walked out." "You still walked out," she said. He nodded. She looked back down at the document. 90 days is not enough time to resolve this loan from current revenue." "I know. We'd need to sell assets." "I know. Or find a second lender." "I've already started making inquiries," he said. "There's a man in Durango who lends against property. The rate is harder than Harcourt's, but he doesn't have a daughter to negotiate with." "What collateral would you use?" "The Western grazing parcel." She looked at the ledger. The Western grazing parcel was not just acreage. It was good acreage quality, grass-reliable water access, the kind of land that would hurt to lose and was difficult to recover once it was leveraged. "That's your best land after the home parcel," she said. "I know that too. And if the revenue projections don't hold, Mabel." His voice was quiet, but very direct. "I understand the risk. I've been running this ranch for 12 years. I know what I'm putting up." He paused. "I'm not asking you to approve it. I'm telling you what I've decided because you manage these accounts and you deserve to know." She sat back. It was the right thing to say, and he had said it exactly right. And the fact that he had said it exactly right was doing nothing to help her maintain the professional clarity she had been working very hard to maintain. "All right," she said. "I'll adjust the projections to account for the new loan terms as soon as you have them." "Thank you," he said. He stood. He picked up the document from her desk and folded it back into his jacket. I was almost to the door when she said his name. He turned. "You said no," she said. "To erasing the whole debt. To securing the ranch's future. Because Vivienne Harcourt said something unkind about me." "She said it kindly," he said. "Rhett." He looked at her for a long moment. "I said no, because marrying someone I don't love to save land. I'd lose anyway. Inside 10 years without the right partner isn't saving anything. It's just slowing the loss down." He paused. "The land isn't the point." She didn't say anything. "The land is never the point," he said. And then he walked out. She sat at the desk for a long time after he left. She was not going to think about what he meant by the right partner. She was categorically, definitively, absolutely not going to think about that. She picked up her pencil. She went back to the numbers. She was still at the desk at 6 o'clock when Dorothea appeared in the doorway with a plate of biscuits and the expression of a woman who had raised Mabel Henshaw for 28 years and could read her daughter's face the way most people read large print text. "What happened?" Dorothea said. "Sit down, Mama," Mabel said. She told her most of it. Not all of it. The banknote, the proposal. Rhett's refusal, the Durango lender. She told it straight and flat, the way she told everything, and Dorothea sat across from her and ate one of the biscuits and listened without interrupting, and when Mabel finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He turned it down," Dorothea said. "Yes. Because of you." "Because of his own principles," Mabel said carefully. Dorothea looked at her daughter with the patience of a woman who had been watching Mabel carefully for 28 years. "Mabel, honey, those two things are not mutually exclusive." "Mama." "Eat a biscuit," Dorothea said. "You think better when you've eaten something." Mabel ate a biscuit. She did not think better. She thought about exactly the same things she'd been thinking about, which was not helpful. 3 days later, Vivienne Harcourt came to town. Mabel knew she was there before she saw her, because small towns are warning systems as much as communities, and word traveled from the post office to the feed merchant to Cole Briggs, who mentioned it to Silas, who came to the cottage that evening with the specific expression of a younger brother who has information he's not sure how to deliver. "Vivienne Harcourt was at the hotel today," he said. "I know," Mabel said. "She was talking to people." "About what?" Silas looked at his hands. "About you and Rhett. About why Rhett didn't take her father's offer." He paused. "She's saying Rhett could have cleared everything. That he put the ranch at risk because you've gotten some kind of hold on him." Mabel was quiet. "People are listening," Silas said. "Mabel, the way she tells it." "How does she tell it?" He met her eyes. "Sympathetically," he said. "Like she's worried about him." Mabel set down her cup. "Of course she does." She went to town the following morning. Not for supplies. Not for any errand she could point to if someone asked. She went because she had thought carefully overnight about what a strategic woman does when a story is being told about her, and she had concluded that the worst thing she could do was stay invisible while the story grew. She walked the main street with the same composure she always carried, and she spoke to 4 people she knew professionally. The grain merchant, the hotel cook who took her bread orders, the seamstress who had once been polite to her when nobody else was bothering, and she conducted those conversations with the same quiet, direct efficiency she brought to everything, and she let people see that she was not hiding, and she was not ashamed, and she had not done anything she needed to be ashamed of. It was not dramatic. It did not feel like a victory. But visibility was the only weapon she had that cost nothing and left no damage behind. She was on her way back to the wagon when she heard her name. Not from behind her, from her right. From the open door of the bank's external sitting room, which was where Cornelius Harcourt occasionally met clients who weren't important enough for the inner office, but weren't unimportant enough to ignore. Vivienne Harcourt was standing in the doorway. Mabel. Her voice was pleasant. Perfectly pleasant. "Do you have a moment?" Mabel stopped walking. Every instinct she had said, "Keep moving." But every instinct she had also said that walking away from this conversation would be interpreted as the kind of retreat that followed her for months. She turned. "A short one," she said. She walked toward the doorway, but did not go inside. She stood at the threshold and let Vivienne have the interior space, and stood in the full visibility of the street herself, which was deliberate because whatever was about to happen, she wanted witnesses to the fact that it had happened in the open. Vivienne looked at her with the same beautiful, measured expression she always wore. "I want you to know that I bear you no personal ill will," she said. "That's generous," Mabel said. "I want you to understand the position Rhett is in." Vivienne's voice was warm, with a particular kind of concern that had edges under it. "He is a proud man. He would not want you to know how serious his financial situation is, because he would not want you to feel responsible for his choices." "His situation is in the accounts," Mabel said. "I manage the accounts. I know the situation." Something moved briefly through Vivienne's expression. "Then you know that without resolution, he could lose everything within a year." "I know the numbers," Mabel said. "Yes. And you know that my father's offer would have resolved it completely." "I know that too." Vivienne took one careful step forward. Her voice dropped just slightly. "Mabel, I am asking you woman, to consider what your presence at that ranch is costing him. He turned down his future because of you. He is risking his land because of you. Whatever you think his feelings are." She paused. A man in debt is not always the best judge of his own decisions. The boardwalk was quiet. 2 women from the church auxiliary were across the street. The hotel doorman had found something interesting to watch from his post. Everyone within 40 feet was listening. Mabel had known this would be the moment. She had actually prepared for it in the way she prepared for everything, not with speeches, but with clarity. Getting very clear the night before on exactly what was true and what she was willing to say in public. She looked at Vivienne Harcourt directly, and she said in a voice that was perfectly composed and perfectly audible, "Miss Harcourt, a man's heart is not collateral, and neither is mine." She paused. "Rhett Calder made his decision. It was his decision to make. I was not consulted, and I did not ask to be, because I have no interest in being the reason someone makes a choice that large. Whatever he decides about his ranch and his future and his finances, he decides as a free man with good judgment." She held Vivienne's gaze. "And if you genuinely respected him, you would believe the same." The silence lasted exactly long enough. Then Mabel said, "Good day, Miss Harcourt," and walked back to the wagon at the same unhurried pace she had always used, because Mabel Henshaw had never once in her life run from anything. She was 2 miles outside of town before her hands started shaking. Not from fear. From the specific physical aftermath of having held herself completely still for longer than was natural, of having compressed every real feeling she had about this situation into 2 sentences and delivered them in public without letting a single crack show. She gripped the reins and breathed and let her hands shake for a few minutes because there was nobody to see it and the horses didn't care. By the time she reached Calder Ridge, she was steady again. She went to the cottage. She washed her hands. She sat down with her notebook and did 40 minutes of arithmetic, because arithmetic was the most reliable way she knew to return herself to a functional state. When she was done, she made tea and sat at the table and thought very carefully about what she actually felt now that she was alone enough to feel it honestly. She was in love with Rhett Calder. She had known it for at least 2 weeks. She had been refusing to know it for longer than that. She had been declining to examine it with the same disciplined precision she applied to every number she didn't want to face, and sitting at that table in the lamplight, she was finally honest enough with herself to stop declining. She was in love with him, and she was not going to do anything about it. Not yet. Not while she was still living on his property and earning his wages and dependent on the arrangement he had constructed for her. Not while she could not be certain, completely honestly certain, that what she felt was not shaped by gratitude, by proximity, by the enormous relief of being seen clearly for the first time in her adult life. She needed to know it was real. She needed to know it was hers. She needed to be the kind of woman who could walk away from Calder Ridge entirely before she agreed to stay. She was still sitting with that understanding, still holding it carefully in both hands, like a thing she wasn't certain she could carry without breaking when she heard the knock at the cottage door. She opened it. Rhett stood on the step. He looked at her face, and then he said, "Silas told me you went to town." "I had errands." He said you talked to Vivienne. She stepped back from the door. Come in. He came inside and stood in the middle of the cottage kitchen, and she leaned against the counter and crossed her arms and told him exactly what had happened, the same way she told him everything straight sequential, without editorializing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. What she said, he started. About the cost of Rhett. Mabel looked at him steadily. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, all right? Did you turn down Cornelius Harcourt's offer because of me? He held her gaze for a long time. And then, instead of deflecting, instead of giving her the diplomatic answer she had half expected from a proud man in a difficult position, he said quietly and without decoration, yes. The word landed between them like something physical. Yes, he said again. Not only because of you. Everything I said about the land and the partnership was true. But yes, you were in the room even when you weren't in the room, and I am not sorry for that. Mabel looked at the floor for a moment. When she looked up, she said, I can't. She stopped. Started again. You need to understand something about my position, Rhett. I live on your property. I earn your wage. My mother and brother are here because you made that possible. I cannot tell you what I feel with any honesty until I know that what I feel doesn't have those things inside it. His expression shifted. Not hurt. Something more careful than hurt. Are you saying? I'm saying I need to know it's real, she said. I need to know I'm not. I need to be certain that I'm choosing you because I want you. Not because I need what you've given me. He was very quiet. I don't think you're that woman, he said. I've never thought you were that woman. I know you don't think so, she said. I need to think so, for myself. Another silence. Then he said in the softest voice she had heard from him, Then choose me when you don't need me. She looked at him. I'll wait, he said simply. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to make this harder than it already is. He picked up his hat from the chair where he'd set it. You know where I'll be. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said without turning around, For what it's worth, what you said to Vivienne today, in the street. A pause. I heard about it from 4 different people on the way home. He was quiet for a moment. That was the bravest thing I've seen in a long time. He walked out. Mabel stood in the kitchen for a very long time, and then from the back room, she heard Dorothea's voice quiet and without surprise, as though she had heard the whole thing through the thin wall and had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment. Mabel, her mother said. She appeared in the doorway. Dorothea was sitting up in the lamplight with her Bible in her lap and the expression of a woman who was going to say something true even though the timing was inconvenient. Being needed, her mother said, is not the same thing as being loved. Mabel opened her mouth. Sit down, Dorothea said gently. Let me tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. Mabel sat. Outside the night was settling over Calder Ridge, cold and deep and full of stars. And inside the cottage, with her mother's voice, steady, and her hands finally still in her lap. Mabel Henshaw began for the first time in a very long time to understand the difference between a life she had built for other people and the one that might still be waiting for her to claim it. What she didn't know yet was that the worst was not behind her. Cornelius Harcourt's 2-week deadline was running. Rhett had ridden to Durango the previous Thursday and returned with terms that were harder than anything Mabel had seen in the accounts, and she had looked at those terms and understood exactly how much land was at risk if the revenue projections slipped even slightly. And 3 days from now, something was going to happen that made every number she had ever calculated feel suddenly terrifyingly small. 3 days from now, Dorothea Henshaw's breathing was going to change in the night, and everything else, the debt, the bank, the proposal, the love, she hadn't let herself name until tonight was going to stop mattering in the way that only one thing can make everything else stop mattering. Mabel heard it at 2 a.m. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. Dorothea's breathing had a rhythm Mabel had been tracking unconsciously for 2 years. The way you track a clock you've lived with long enough that you only notice it when it stops. What woke her was the break in that rhythm. A long pause. Then a shallow pull of air. Then another pause that lasted too long. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. Dorothea was conscious when Mabel reached her. Her eyes were open, and she was looking at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a person conserving every resource they had left. When she heard Mabel come through the door, she turned her head slowly and said in a voice that was much smaller than her usual voice, "Don't be frightened." "I'm not frightened," Mabel said, which was the most complete lie she had told in years. She sent Silas for the doctor at a dead run, and she sat on the edge of her mother's bed and held Dorothea's hand and talked. Not about anything important. About the morning light through the front window, about the bread order she had to fill by Thursday, about the way the ranch looked different in the early dark before anyone else was awake. She talked the way you talk to someone when you need them to stay with you, and you know that silence has too much room in it for the wrong things to settle. Dorothea listened, squeezed her hand once, said, "You always did talk prettiest when you were scared." "I told you I'm not scared." "Mabel." Her mother's voice was dry even now. "You've been squeezing my hand hard enough to leave marks for the last 10 minutes. Mabel loosened her grip. She did not let go. The doctor arrived 40 minutes later. He was there for an hour. When he came out of the bedroom, his face told her everything before he opened his mouth, and she stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed and her chin level and received the information with the same composure she had always used to receive information that required composure. Dorothea's lungs were failing. Not acutely, not tonight, but the process was moving faster now. Weeks, he said, rather than months. Rest, warmth, no exertion. Beyond that, he didn't have much to offer except the truth, which was that her mother's body had been working very hard for a very long time and was beginning to put down the work. When he left, Mabel sat at the kitchen table for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. She gave herself exactly that long, and in those 5 minutes, she felt every single thing she had been managing and suppressing and setting aside with such disciplined precision, felt it all at once fully without armor, and it was enormous, and it was terrible, and it was real. Then she got up. She washed her face. She went back to her mother's room. By the time dawn came, she had made a decision. Dorothea had asked 2 days after moving to the cottage. In the quiet way, she asked the things that mattered to her most, whether she might see the old homestead again before winter settled in completely. She hadn't pressed it. She never pressed things. But Mabel had heard the asking underneath the not asking, and she had filed it in the category of things to arrange when the time was right. And standing in her mother's room in the pale early light, she understood that the window for right was narrowing faster than she had allowed herself to believe. She went to find Rhett at first light. He was already in the yard. She didn't know if someone had told him, or if he had simply heard something in the movement of the household that woke him the way it had woken her. But he was there, and when she came across the yard toward him, he read her face immediately and set down what he was holding. "I need to take my mother back to the homestead," she said. "For a visit, one day. She needs to see it while she still can." "When?" he said. "Today." I didn't ask about the accounts, or the Thursday bread order, or the supply invoice she had been intending to dispute. He said, "I'll have the wagon ready in an hour." She looked at him. "Rhett." "An hour," he said. "Go get her ready." She went. Dorothea was dressed and sitting up when Mabel came back to the room, which meant she had been awake and listening, and had drawn her own conclusions, which was entirely typical of Dorothea Henshaw. "We're going to the homestead," Mabel said. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "Today." Today. Something moved through Dorothea's face, not surprise, something deeper than that. Something relieved. "All right," she said quietly. "Help me with my good shawl." The drive out took 40 minutes. Rhett sat at the front of the wagon with Silas, and they talked about livestock in the easy technical way of two people who share working knowledge, and in the back. Mabel sat beside her mother and didn't talk much because Dorothea was watching the land go by with the particular attention of someone making a detailed record of something they understand they may not see again. When the homestead came into view, Dorothea made a small sound that was not quite a word. Mabel felt it in her chest like a stone. The house was dusty and still, the garden gone to dormancy, the gate hanging at its familiar slight angle that Silas had been meaning to fix for 2 years. It looked smaller than memory made it, and more loved than neglect should have allowed the particular paradox of the places that hold the most important things. Silas jumped down before the wagon fully stopped and went straight to the gate without being asked. He had it rehung and level inside 15 minutes, and the sound of the wood swinging clean and true on its repaired hinge was such a small thing, and such an exact thing, that Mabel had to look away for a moment. Rhett helped Dorothea down from the wagon with a steadiness and gentleness that Mabel watched from 3 feet away, and said nothing about, because there was nothing adequate to say. He offered his arm, and she took it without ceremony, and he walked her to the front step, and then stepped back and let her go inside alone, because he understood without being told that the first moments inside that house belonged to her and to nobody else. Mabel followed her in. The house smelled of dust and old wood, and something underneath those things that was purely itself the smell of every morning. She had ever woken here, every winter, fire, every supper her mother had made in that kitchen when Mabel was young enough that the world had still felt like a manageable size. Dorothea moved through the rooms slowly. She touched the doorframe of the kitchen. She stood in front of the window, where the light came in the same way it always had, unchanged. She opened the door of the bedroom she had shared with Mabel's father for 22 years, and stood in the doorway for a long time without going in. Mabel stood behind her and didn't say a word. When Dorothea turned around, her eyes were wet, but her face was composed. She had always been composed. It was where Mabel had learned it. "Help me with the trunk," Dorothea said. The cedar trunk sat at the foot of the bedroom closet where it always had, and Mabel dragged it out and opened the latch, and Dorothea knelt beside it slowly with Mabel's help, and reached inside with the certainty of a woman who knew exactly where things were. She lifted out a dress. White, or what had once been white cream, now aged and carefully folded, wrapped in a cloth to protect the lace. The dress Dorothea had worn to marry Mabel's father 41 years ago. The lace at the collar and cuffs was hand-worked, delicate, and exact, the kind of work that took months and was made to last longer than the woman who made it. Dorothea held it out to Mabel. Mabel didn't take it immediately. She looked at it. "Mama," she said carefully. "It'll need altering," Dorothea said. "Martha Egan in town does good work. She'd know how to let it out properly and keep the lace." She pushed it gently toward Mabel. "Take it." "I'm not," Mabel started. "I know you're not," Dorothea said. "Not yet, but you will be, and I want to know you have it." She paused. "I want to know it's going to be worn again. A dress like this needs to be worn." Mabel took the dress. She held it with both hands and looked at her mother kneeling by the trunk in the dusty light of the bedroom, and she felt something she had been holding in careful suspension for weeks begin very slowly to shift. They stayed at the homestead through the middle of the afternoon. Rhett fixed a broken kitchen hinge without being asked, found the toolbox where it had always been, and located the problem in 3 minutes and resolved it in 5, and then found 3 other small repairs to make, simply because the materials were at hand, and the need was there. And Mabel watched him move through her family's house with a quiet usefulness that was entirely without performance, and felt something she had no appropriate word for in its presence. Silas made coffee on the old stove. Dorothea sat in her usual chair and drank it, and looked out the window at the land that had been hers and her husband's, and said things in no particular order. Memories, mostly fragments. The names of neighbors, long moved away. A story about a winter 20 years ago that Mabel had heard before and listened to again as though it were new, because she understood that this was the listening her mother needed her to do. Rhett sat across the table and listened too. He didn't perform interest. He just listened the way he did everything, with his full and unhurried attention. And when Dorothea said something funny, he laughed genuinely. And when she said something sad, he was quiet without making the silence heavy. And by the time the light began to shift in the afternoon, Mabel had watched her mother look at Rhett Calder 3 times, with the particular expression Dorothea reserved for things she had already made up her mind about. They drove back as the sun was dropping. Dorothea slept most of the way, her head against Mabel's shoulder, the dress folded in the cloth on Mabel's lap, and Mabel sat very still and let her sleep, and looked at the darkening land, and held the dress, and thought about absolutely nothing, because sometimes the mind reaches a place where thought is not the right tool, and you simply have to sit inside what is true. Dorothea died 11 days later. Peacefully in the night, in her bed, in the cottage with the window she had loved, and the morning light she had sat in every day. Mabel was with her. Silas was with her. Rhett sat in the kitchen through the night and didn't come in unless asked and wasn't asked. But he was there, and Mabel knew he was there, and in some way she could not have explained, it was the most important thing anyone did for her that night. She was buried beside her husband beneath the cottonwood at the homestead, which was what she had wanted and what Mabel had arranged 2 days in advance of needing to, because that was how Mabel did things. The service was small. The ranch hands came. Cole Briggs held his hat in his hands and looked at the ground with the dignity of a man who understood grief without needing to be taught it. Several women from town came, including, to Mabel's genuine surprise, the seamstress who had always been polite to her, who brought food and said nothing unnecessary, and was exactly the right kind of present. Clara Dubois did not come. Mabel did not think about Clara Dubois after the burial. Rhett stood beside Mabel at the cottonwood for a moment, before the others drifted back to the wagons. He didn't put his arm around her. He didn't offer words because he had the sense to know that words were not what this moment required. He simply stood there close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him and let her have the grief without trying to manage it. When she was ready to go, she turned. He was looking at the cottonwood. She was a remarkable woman, he said. Yes, Mabel said. She was. They walked back to the wagons. The grief did not disappear. Mabel had not expected it to disappear. It moved into her like weather moving into a landscape, not destroying the terrain, but changing everything about how the light fell across it, so that familiar things looked different, and you had to relearn how to read them. She woke in the night sometimes and reached for a sound that wasn't there. She sat at her desk in the mornings and began sentences in her head that had Dorothea as their destination and had to stop and reroute them. She did not fall apart. She also did not pretend. That was the difference between this grief and the griefs she had swallowed before. She let it be visible. Not dramatically, not in ways that asked anything of anyone, but she stopped performing steadiness. She did not entirely feel, and discovered that the world did not collapse when she stopped holding it together by force. Rhett never used her grief to draw himself closer. That was the thing she noticed most in the weeks that followed, and could not stop noticing. He did not increase his attentiveness. He did not position himself as the available comfort. He gave her more space, not less, and the space was not coldness. It was the specific warmth of a man who trusted a woman to know what she needed and refused to assume it was him. She found this so profoundly correct that it unsettled her all over again. She was 3 weeks past the burial when she made the decision. It did not arrive dramatically. It arrived the way real decisions arrive after a long accumulation of smaller knowings that finally reach a weight you can no longer pretend you aren't carrying. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her private notebook and her own accounts. The preserves business separate from Calder Ridge entirely hers. And she was looking at the figures, and the figures told her something she had been watching approach for weeks. She could leave. Not immediately, not without a transition period. But the income from the preserves orders was now reliable enough and growing steadily enough that if she found a small property to lease, nothing like the cottage, something simple and manageable, she could support herself and Silas on what she earned from work that belonged entirely to her. She did not need Calder Ridge anymore. The understanding arrived without fanfare. She sat with it for a long time, turning it over, checking it for holes. The way she checked every figure, looking for the place where the arithmetic didn't hold. She found none. She could go. She sat at that table and asked herself with complete honesty whether she wanted to. The answer she got was not simple, and she had not expected it to be simple. It was layered and complicated, and had grief inside it, and hope inside it, and something that had grown slowly and stubbornly through months of coffee at dawn, and shared ledgers, and a man who bought beans he didn't need, and fixed a kitchen hinge without being asked, and stood beside a grave without saying a single inadequate word. But underneath all of it, underneath every layer, when she got down to the bedrock of the thing, the answer was the same one it had been since a Monday morning in April, when a man had walked through a mercantile door and asked for coffee with more concentration than the question required. She wanted to stay. Not because she had to. Not because the numbers required it, or the situation demanded it, or gratitude had accumulated into something that wore love's shape. Because she wanted to. Because Rhett Calder was the first person in her adult life who had looked at everything. She was the capability, and the caution, and the pride, and the grief, and the body. She had spent 28 years being told, was something to apologize for, and called it enough. Called it more than enough. Had spent 3 months buying imaginary supplies to stand near it for 12 minutes on a Monday morning. She closed her notebook. She sat at the table for another moment. Then she stood up, and she put on her coat, and she walked out of the cottage and across the yard to the corral, where Rhett was working a young horse through its evening routine. He saw her coming. He finished what he was doing with the horse, unhurried, deliberate the way he did everything, and then he moved to the fence and waited. She stopped a few feet from him. She said, "You told me to choose you when I didn't need you." He went very still. She reached into her coat and set her private notebook on the top fence rail between them. "Look at the last page." He picked it up. He read the last page. She watched him understand what the numbers said. She watched him understand what it meant that she was showing them to him. He set the notebook back on the fence rail. I didn't say anything. He was waiting. She understood he was waiting, and she had come out here prepared to make him wait a moment longer, because she had spent so much of her life being needed, and she needed this. She needed the pause. She needed the full weight of a choice she was making from a position of freedom, with both feet on solid ground. "I don't," she said. His face changed. Just slightly. Just enough. "I don't need you," she said. "I don't need this ranch, or this job, or this roof." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to understand that clearly before I say what I'm going to say next." "I understand it," he said quietly. "Good." She picked the notebook up from the fence and put it back in her coat. "Then I want you to know that I am choosing you. Not the land, not the wage, not the situation you made possible." She held his gaze without flinching. "You. Because I want you. Because I have wanted you with increasing and inconvenient certainty, since approximately the 3rd week you came into that mercantile with a made-up shopping list, and I have been refusing to look at it directly for considerably longer than was reasonable." Something broke open in Rhett Calder's face that she had never seen there before. Not dramatically, not with any of the performative emotion that lesser moments got from lesser men. Just a quiet opening like a door that had been waiting a very long time. "Mabel," he said. "Don't say something simple," she said. "I've come all the way out here in the cold." He laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it changed his whole face, and she loved him so completely in that moment that it was almost frightening. Then he said, "Will you marry me?" Not a question exactly, more like a fact presented for confirmation. She considered it for exactly the amount of time it deserved. "Yes," she said, "but I keep my business. I would never suggest otherwise. And we renegotiate my bookkeeping rate, fairly." "Absolutely. And Silas keeps his position regardless of whatever happens between us personally." "Mabel." His voice was warm and certain and entirely serious. "Silas is the best hand I have with a difficult horse. He's not going anywhere." She nodded once. He reached over the fence and took her hand. She let him. His grip was exactly what she had known it would be, warm and careful, and without anything to prove, and she stood at the corral fence in the cold evening air of Calder Ridge and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember the specific and unfamiliar lightness of a woman who has just chosen something purely because she wanted it. But that was not the end of what needed resolving. The Durango loan was still on the books. The western grazing parcel was still leveraged. The ranch's financial position was better than it had been 3 months ago, but better was not safe, and Mabel understood the difference between those two things more precisely than almost anyone. The following morning, she sat down at the office desk, and she did not open the household ledger or the supply accounts. She opened the file she had been building quietly for the past 2 weeks, the one she had not mentioned to Rhett because she had not been certain yet whether what she had was enough to be worth mentioning. It was the Finch file. Expanded. What had started as a documentation of duplicate invoices and short-delivered hay had grown over weeks of careful cross-referencing into something considerably more significant. Garrett Finch had not been operating alone. The billing discrepancies at Calder Ridge were part of a pattern. She had found the same signature in the records of two other ranches, whose purchasing invoices she had obtained through entirely legitimate means, through conversations with ranch managers who trusted her arithmetic and were willing to share their files once she explained what she was looking at. 3 ranches. The same supplier. A consistent 20% overcharge on feed quantities. 2 years of records. She had the documentation for all of it. And she had something else. A name. A second name connected to Finch through a payment record she had found in a set of accounts that had been misfiled, genuinely misfiled, not concealed, just lost in the disorganization that had made Calder Ridge's books so vulnerable in the first place. A payment from Finch's operating account to a man named Aldous Pryor, who was, among other things, Cornelius Harcourt's personal bookkeeper. She sat with this for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and began writing a letter to the county clerk's office. She wrote 3 drafts. The third one was right, precise, factual, unemotional, with every claim supported by the document number that corresponded to it. She attached a copy of every relevant record. She wrote a second letter to the Territorial Trade Commission. She wrote a third to a lawyer in Denver, whose name she had obtained from the grain merchant who had used him once in a boundary dispute, and said he was the kind of man who read a contract the way other men read a weapon. She had all 3 letters sealed and addressed before Rhett came to the office that morning. She set them on the desk in front of him without preamble. "Read those," she said. He read them, all 3. He read them the way she had learned he read everything important completely, without rushing, going back twice on the sections that required it. When he was finished, he set them down and looked at her. "Pryor," he said. "Harcourt's bookkeeper," she said. "Yes. You're saying Cornelius knew." "I'm saying his bookkeeper was receiving payments from the man who was systematically overcharging 3 of his bank's client ranches." She paused. "What Cornelius knew, a legal inquiry will have to determine. What I can prove is the payment record." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. "Mabel, if you send these letters, and this goes to a formal inquiry, it is going to make Cornelius Harcourt a very powerful and motivated enemy. He's already called your note," she said. "He already tried to purchase you through his daughter. At what point does the word enemy begin to apply?" He looked at her. "Send the letters," he said. She picked them up. "I'll take them to the post office myself," she said. "Today, before either of us changes our mind." "I'm not going to change my mind." "I know." She stood. "I'm accounting for myself." She rode to town alone. She posted all 3 letters at the town post office herself, pushing them through the slot one at a time with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that certain acts once performed reorganize the world around them permanently. Then she stood on the boardwalk outside the post office in the October air and looked at the main street of Red Willow crossing the Mercantile, where she had worked for 6 years. The bank at the end of the block, where Cornelius Harcourt sat behind his polished desk. The hotel where Vivienne had held her carefully managed conversations, and she felt none of the things she had expected to feel. Not fear, not triumph, not the cold satisfaction of an account settled. Just clarity. The kind that comes after you have done the thing that needed doing, and the doing of it has made the next step visible. She mounted up and rode back to Calder Ridge. Rhett was waiting at the gate. He had the expression of a man who had spent the last 2 hours sitting with a decision he'd already made, and was satisfied with it. And when he saw her face, he nodded once. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. She dismounted. She handed him the reins. Their hands touched in the exchange, and neither of them moved for a moment, standing at the gate of Calder Ridge in the cool morning air, with the letters already in the post and the future already in motion. And Mabel thought about the girl who had walked 4 miles home every evening to a household that needed her, and had never once left room in the arithmetic for anything that was purely her own. She thought about Dorothea's voice through a thin wall. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. She thought about the counter at Bellwether Mercantile and a man who needed cinnamon. She took her hand back. She walked toward the office. She had accounts to finish. The letters arrived where they needed to arrive. The county clerk's office responded first within 10 days with a formal acknowledgement that an inquiry had been opened into the billing practices of Garrett Finch and associated accounts. The Territorial Trade Commission responded 6 days after that. The lawyer in Denver, a man named Harlow Greer, who wrote the way Mabel thought in clean declarative sentences with nothing wasted, responded within the week and said he had reviewed the documentation she had forwarded and believed there was sufficient basis for a civil claim. He asked for a meeting at her earliest convenience. Mabel wrote back the same day she received his letter and gave him a date. She told Rhett about the meeting at supper that evening. He looked at her across the table for a moment. "You already wrote back." "The date works," she said. "Mabel." There was something in his voice that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, and lived in the precise territory between them. "You could have discussed it with me first." "I'm discussing it with you now," she said. "You've already committed to the date." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back. "What date?" he said. She told him. "That works," he said, and went back to his supper, and she saw the corner of his mouth move and did not comment on it because she was also trying not to smile, and they were both dignified people. Harlow Greer was a compact, precise man of about 50 who wore good boots and carried a leather case and had the particular quality of a lawyer who had won enough cases to stop needing to perform confidence. He came to Calder Ridge rather than requiring Mabel and Rhett to travel to Denver, which told her something about how seriously he was taking the documentation before he said a single word about it. He spent 2 hours with Mabel's files. He asked 14 questions, all of them specific and intelligent. He asked Mabel 4 of them directly, which meant he had already understood who had assembled the case and was not pretending otherwise. When he finished, he set his pen down and said, "The Pryor connection is the linchpin. If you can establish that payment from Finch to Pryor as compensation rather than coincidence, you implicate Harcourt's operation directly." "The payment record shows 12 separate transfers across 18 months, Mabel said. "Regular intervals, consistent amounts. Pryor has no documented business relationship with Finch outside of those transfers. You'll need to say that in a deposition." "I understand." Greer looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Henshaw." "Miss Henshaw," she said. He accepted the correction without blinking. "Miss Henshaw, Cornelius Harcourt is not a man who receives legal pressure without responding to it. Once this inquiry moves formally, he will come at this from every direction he has available. His lawyers are better funded than mine. His connections in this county are considerable." "I know that," Mabel said. "You may face social consequences that extend beyond the legal proceedings." "Mr. Greer," Mabel said evenly, "I have already been fired from my job, publicly accused of scheming above my station, and had my professional reputation attacked by a woman with considerably more money than evidence. I am not certain what additional social consequences you believe would be novel at this point." Harlow Greer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll take the case." What happened next did not happen quickly, and Mabel had known it would not happen quickly, and she had prepared herself for that. The way she prepared herself for everything, by looking at the realistic timeline with clear eyes and refusing to mistake the distance for impossibility. The inquiry moved through the county clerk's office with the deliberate pace of institutional processes that could not be hurried without being damaged. Greer filed the civil claim. Finch's lawyers responded with a counterfiling that was Mabel noted when she read it long on language and short on actual counter-evidence, which told her something useful. Pryor resigned from Harcourt's bookkeeping operation within 3 weeks of the inquiry opening, which told her something more useful still. Cornelius Harcourt did not come quietly. He came the way powerful men come when they feel their position threatened, not directly, not in ways that could be attached to him by name, but through the accumulated pressure of the system he had spent 30 years building. The bank found 2 minor technical irregularities in the documentation for Rhett's Durango loan and sent formal notice that an administrative review had been initiated. A grain supplier who had been considering a contract with Calder Ridge withdrew his interest without explanation. 2 of Mabel's smaller preserve orders from neighboring ranches were quietly canceled within the same week. She logged every single one of these events in a separate notebook. She brought the notebook to Harlow Greer on his next visit. He read through it and said, "This is either a pattern of intimidation or a remarkable coincidence." "It is not a coincidence," Mabel said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." He added the notebook to his case file. "This is actually helpful, Miss Henshaw. A man who pressures witnesses creates a record of the pressure." Cole Briggs came to Mabel one morning in the third week of November with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has something to say and isn't certain of the reception. "I heard about the loan review," he said. "From one of Harcourt's men. He was talking in town like it was settled, like the ranch was already as good as foreclosed." Mabel looked at him steadily. "What did you say to him?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "I said the woman who runs these books has never made an error I could find, and I've been looking because it's my job to know what's happening here." He paused. "I said he'd better hope his documentation was cleaner than ours, because if it came to a comparison, I knew which set of books I'd rather be defending." Mabel felt something move through her that she didn't immediately name. "Thank you, Cole. Ranch is worth defending," he said simply. "You made it worth defending." He put his hat back and went back to work. She went back to her desk and sat down and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed for a moment, and thought about how long it had taken her to understand that being seen by people whose judgment you respected was a different thing entirely from being seen by people who simply wanted something from you. The formal inquiry hearing was scheduled for the second week of January. In the weeks leading up to it, Mabel did several things that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings. She approached the two ranches, whose preserve orders had been canceled, and offered to deliver trial quantities at no charge, so they could make their purchasing decisions on the quality of the product rather than on whatever they had been told by whoever had told them. One of the ranchers accepted immediately. The other took a week and then wrote a letter saying he'd heard the whole situation from his wife's perspective, and his wife had opinions about men who pressured women's livelihoods, and he'd like 6 jars of the apple preserves, and could she do a standing monthly order? She wrote back yes and logged the account. She converted the unused ranch outbuilding that Rhett had offered her 3 months earlier, and which she had been declining as unnecessary, and which she now understood she needed. She spent a Saturday cleaning it out with Silas, and the following Monday, she moved her production operation out of the cottage kitchen and into the larger space, which meant she could increase her batch sizes and take on larger orders without the cottage smelling of hot sugar at 5 in the morning, which Rhett had never once complained about, but which she had always known was unreasonable. "You're expanding," Rhett said, looking at the building on the Tuesday morning. "Yes," she said, "without telling me." "I'm telling you now." He looked at her. "It's my business," she said. "I don't ask you to consult me before you buy cattle." "Fair," he said. "I'll need the use of the building formalized in the partnership agreement." "We don't have a partnership agreement." "We will," she said. "I've asked Greer to draft one. Given the current circumstances, I think it's important that the business arrangements between us are on paper and clearly independent of the personal arrangement." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're protecting me." "I'm protecting both of us," she said. "If Harcourt's people are looking for financial entanglement to complicate the civil claim, I want our accounts demonstrably separate." He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was the same one she had first identified across a mercantile counter, somewhere between amusement and deep specific admiration, wearing the mask of calm. "All right," he said. "Tell Greer I'll sign whatever needs signing." The January hearing was not dramatic in the way that trials in stories are dramatic. It was held in a county clerk's office rather than a courthouse because the formal civil claim had not yet reached trial stage, and this was a preliminary inquiry hearing. It lasted 4 hours. Mabel sat beside Harlow Greer at a long table and answered every question she was asked with the precision and composure she brought to every professional task. And when opposing counsel tried twice to reframe her documentation as misinterpretation, she said in the same even voice, "The invoice number on this record corresponds to a delivery of 200 pounds. The ranch log for that date records a delivery of 162 pounds. The difference is not an interpretation, it is arithmetic." The hearing officer asked no follow-up to that. The outcome of the inquiry was not immediate. These things moved slowly, and Mabel had known they would move slowly, and she had structured the months around that reality, rather than holding her breath, waiting for a result she could not accelerate. But 3 weeks after the hearing, Harlow Greer sent a letter that was shorter than his usual correspondence, which meant the news it contained was either very good or very clean. It was both. The inquiry had found sufficient basis to proceed to formal investigation of Finch's billing practices and the prior payment connection. Harcourt's bank had been formally notified that the administrative review of Rhett's Durango loan had been identified as potentially retaliatory in nature and would itself be reviewed. Greer's letter ended with a single sentence. "I believe we are going to win this, Miss Henshaw. It will take time, but we are going to win it." Mabel read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in the file. Then she went to find Rhett. I was at the corral with the young horse he'd been working all winter, and she came across the yard and stood at the fence and held the letter out without a word. He took it. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. "Greer thinks we'll win," he said. "Greer says we'll win," she said. He doesn't use words like think when he means something stronger. Rhett looked at the letter one more time. Then he folded it and handed it back to her and said, "Marry me this spring." She looked at him. "We've already established that I'm marrying you." "I mean this specific spring," he said. "March, April at the latest, before the ranch gets busy and before Greer finds more paperwork for us to sign, and before—" He stopped. Something shifted in his face, quieter and more open than his usual expression. "I have been patient, Mabel. I have been very patient. But I would like to stop referring to you as my bookkeeper to people who have watched us have supper together every evening for 5 months." She looked at him for a long moment. "April," she said. "April," he agreed. She put the letter in her coat and walked back to the office and sat down at her desk and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment. Strong hands, work-hardened hands, the hands of a woman who had managed accounts and kneaded bread and held her mother through a hard night and signed her name to a civil claim against the most powerful man in the county. She was getting married in April. She had a building she was converting into a commercial kitchen. She had a lawyer who used the word win like a man who meant it. She had a life that was beginning at 28 years old to look like something she had built rather than something she had simply survived. She picked up her pencil. She went back to work. The wedding was April 14th. Red Willow Crossing had been waiting for it with the particular appetite of a town that had watched the whole story unfold from the beginning and had opinions about how it should resolve. Some of those opinions were warm. Some of them were the residual discomfort of people who had said unkind things over the preceding year and were now performing revised positions with the cheerfulness of people who hoped nobody was keeping score. Mabel was keeping score. She was also not interested in settling it. Life was too short and the accounts too full for the luxury of sustained grievance, and she had learned from Dorothea that the best response to people who had underestimated you was not anger but altitude, simply rising to a place where their opinions could no longer reach you. She had risen. The ceremony was small. Calder Ridge, not the church in town, because the ranch was theirs, and the church in town belonged to a community that had not yet entirely earned the privilege of witnessing this particular moment. Cole Briggs stood for Rhett. Silas stood for Mabel. The ranch hands arranged themselves along the fence with their good hats and their awkward Sunday postures, and the specific tenderness of working men who were not accustomed to demonstrating emotion and were doing it anyway because the occasion required it. Mabel wore Dorothea's dress. Martha Egan had done the alterations with the skill and respect the garment deserved, letting out the seams and refitting the bodice with such care that the original lace lay exactly as it had been made to lie 41 years ago on a different woman's wedding morning. The dress fit Mabel's large body with dignity and precision, and she wore it without apology and without the shrinking self-consciousness that the town had spent years trying to teach her. She walked toward Rhett across the yard at Calder Ridge, without hesitating, without looking at the fence line where the hands were gathered, without performing anything for anyone. She walked toward him because he was at the end of the walk, and she wanted to get there. He looked at her coming, and something happened in his face that she was going to spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen, not surprise. He had never looked at her with surprise. He had always looked at her as though she was exactly what he had expected, in the best possible sense of that word, as though every time he saw her, she confirmed something he had already known. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he intends to keep. The ceremony was simple. The words were the old words. When the part came where she said yes, she said it clearly, and without hesitation in the voice she used for things that were important, and Rhett said it back to her in the same kind of voice, and then it was done, and the hands were making noise along the fence, and Silas was attempting not to visibly cry and failing. And Mabel stood in her mother's dress in the April sunshine at Calder Ridge, and felt the particular weight and lightness of a woman who has just officially and irrevocably chosen herself a life. Vivienne Harcourt did not come. Mabel had not expected her to come, and had not invited her, and had not spent a single moment thinking about her absence. Vivienne had already begun the process of removing herself from Red Willow Crossing. There were stories about a cousin in San Francisco, about a change of scenery, about Cornelius Harcourt's deteriorating influence in the county following the formal investigation into his bookkeeper's arrangements. These stories reached Mabel the way all stories reached her through the ordinary current of a small town's information flow, and she noted them and moved on. What was happening at the bank was not revenge. It was consequence. She understood the difference and was comfortable with both. The investigation resolved in the summer. Garrett Finch paid restitution to 3 ranches, including Calder Ridge, for documented overbilling. The amounts were not enormous, but they were real, and they were owed, and receiving them felt like the particular satisfaction of a column that had finally balanced. Aldous Pryor was found to have accepted payments in exchange for suppressing client complaints about Finch's billing, which implicated Cornelius Harcourt in a liability he could not entirely deflect despite his lawyer's best efforts. The bank's formal censure did not ruin Cornelius' men. Like Cornelius were rarely ruined entirely, but it cost him something considerable in the currency that mattered most to him, which was the unquestioned authority he had exercised over this county for 30 years. The Durango loan was paid down steadily through the second half of the year. Mabel's production enterprise contributed materially to this through revenues she tracked in her own accounts and transferred to the ranch debt on a formal schedule that Greer had drafted and both she and Rhett had signed. There was no ambiguity in the arrangement. There was no room for ambiguity. She had made certain of that. By December, the western grazing parcel was no longer at risk. Rhett told her on a Tuesday evening, setting the bank confirmation letter on her desk, the way she had once set 3 sealed letters on the post office counter, with the quiet deliberateness of someone completing a thing that had been a long time coming. She read it. She set it down. She looked at him across the desk. "The parcel's clear," she said. "The parcel's clear," he agreed. She nodded once. She picked up her pencil. She made the corresponding entry in the ledger, the specific entry she had been holding space for in the account structure for months, a line that had existed as a placeholder and was now real, and she set the pencil down. "Good," she said. Rhett looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued extensively over the preceding year, and continued to find completely unreasonable in its effect on her. "That's all you have to say. The numbers say the rest," she said. "Mabel." "The ranch is clear, Rhett." Her voice came out softer than she'd intended. She let it. "That's what we worked for. That's what it means." He came around the desk. He stood beside her, and she stayed in her chair and looked up at him, and he put one hand on her shoulder, just his hand, warm and steady, and without any demand in it, and he said, "Your mother would have been glad." That landed somewhere she was not prepared for. She pressed her lips together for a moment, nodded, looked back at the ledger. "She would have said something wise," Mabel said, "and made biscuits." "She would have," Rhett agreed. "And then she would have looked at you the way she always looked at you, and expected you to eat 3 of them, whether you were hungry or not." "I would have eaten 4, he said. "Those were excellent biscuits." Mabel laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the way only the truest things were, and Rhett's hand on her shoulder was warm, and she let herself feel it, and let herself be glad. The kitchen building was fully operational by the following spring. 3 employees, 2 women from town who had heard about the operation through the ordinary means of women's networks that moved faster and more reliably than any newspaper, and a young man Silas had recommended who turned out to have a natural instinct for production scheduling. Mabel trained all 3 herself with the same direct and systematic competence she applied to every task, and found that she was, to her mild surprise, a good teacher, not patient in the indulgent sense, but clear, and clearness, she discovered, was what most people actually needed. The operation supplied preserves, bread, dried goods, and later a line of herbal preparations to ranches across 3 counties. The accounts were separate from Calder Ridge's books, managed in their own ledger system that Mabel maintained herself, and the income was hers, deposited in her own account at a bank that was not controlled by Cornelius Harcourt, in the name of Mabel Calder, doing business as Henshaw Provisions, because she had taken Rhett's name and kept her own in the one place she felt it mattered most. Rhett never suggested any of this was irregular. He suggested once that she might consider taking on a bookkeeper for the production enterprise, so she wasn't managing 2 separate account systems herself, and she told him she would consider it when the volume required it, and he said all right, and asked what was for supper. That was how most of their conversations about the business went. Silas took on full responsibility for the difficult horses on the ranch, which turned into something of a specialty that drew interest from 2 neighboring outfits wanting problem animals worked. He was good at it in the way some people are good at things, not because he had been taught, but because he understood something specific about how scared creatures decided to trust. Mabel watched him work one afternoon from the fence and thought about Dorothea, about the stubbornness of good things that survived hard winters, and felt a gladness so complete and uncomplicated that she simply stood there in it for a while without trying to account for it. Cole Briggs retired the following autumn. He came to the office on his last day and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and told Mabel that in 30 years of ranch work he had met a handful of people who understood what a place was worth, and she was one of them. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he said everything, and she thanked him the same way, and they shook hands, and that was that. She hired his replacement herself. She interviewed 4 candidates, assessed their references with the same methodology she had used to evaluate suppliers, cross-referencing what they said against what she could verify independently, and made her recommendation to Rhett, who accepted it without revision, because he had learned over the better part of a year that Mabel's judgment in these matters was worth more than his second opinion. He still came to the kitchen building sometimes, not every day, not with the manufactured frequency of the mercantile years, but regularly, and always with something: a sack of sugar, a tin of coffee, a bundle of cinnamon sticks that they absolutely did not need, because she ordered cinnamon in bulk from a supplier in Denver now. The first time he did it, she looked at the cinnamon and then looked at him. "We have cinnamon," she said. "I know," he said. "Rhett, I was passing the dry goods store." He set it on the work table with the easy innocence of a man who had been practicing this expression for years. It seemed practical. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing since a Monday morning in 1878, when a man had walked through a mercantile door and asked for coffee with more concentration than the question warranted. She was thoroughly accustomed to it by now. She had stopped trying to make it behave. "You know you don't need that," she said. "I know," he said. "Then why did you buy it?" He gave her the same smile he had given her across the mercantile counter. The real one. The one that changed his whole face. "Needed an excuse to see you." She looked at him. The work table between them was not a mercantile counter. This building was hers. The accounts were hers. The name on the door was hers. Her mother's dress was hanging in a cedar trunk in the bedroom of the house at Calder Ridge, carefully rewrapped and preserved, waiting for a daughter she might one day have, who might one day want it. She was not a woman who needed anyone to rescue her. She never had been. Rhett Calder had never tried to rescue her. He had simply done the one thing that almost nobody in Red Willow Crossing had thought to do. He had looked at Mabel Henshaw with clear eyes, without pity and without condescension, and seen exactly what was there: the intelligence, the discipline, the dry humor, and the stubbornness, and the grief, and the enormous painstaking love she had spent her entire adult life pouring into everyone around her, without once stopping to ask what she wanted in return. He had seen it, and he had stayed. Not because she needed him to stay, because she was worth staying for. She picked up the cinnamon. She set it on the supply shelf in its proper place. She turned around. "Supper's at 6, she said. "Don't be late." He tipped his hat. He walked back out into the Colorado afternoon, and she watched him cross the yard toward the corral, and she went back to her work. Her building, her accounts, her name on the door, and the life that Mabel Henshaw had built for herself, with her own hands and her own mind, and her own stubborn, unbreakable insistence on being worth exactly what she was, went on. She had walked into that mercantile every morning for 6 years, expecting nothing. She had walked out of it with everything. Not because someone had given it to her, because she had finally, after a lifetime of giving herself away in pieces, chosen to keep herself whole, and in doing so had become the kind of woman that the right man could not invent enough excuses to stay near. Mabel Calder was never the woman anyone settled for. She was the woman a good man chose freely, completely, and without reservation, and she chose him back from a place of such absolute freedom that the choice meant everything. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was more than enough.